I will find it. My high-tech friend here, really, thank you so much for making me so welcome, Tricia, and all of you, and to whomever paid the fabulously expensive airfare ticket between Denver and Sydney. It's wonderful to be in a community that cares enough to initiate a project like this. It's a week-long session that we have ahead of us, and this is the very first time I've had the opportunity to meet with you. So I'm just thrilled, I have to say. I brought the rain with me, maybe, but I think it was here before. You know? It wasn't all my doing. But it's a good time to bring us together to have this conversation. So let me just tell you a few things about me so you'll know. I'm actually, I think of myself as an accidental disaster sociologist. I was a sociologist with a focus on gender. Hadn't a clue about disasters. Did I care about flooding? No. And then we moved to Miami 2 months before Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And of course, we bought the house that was in the eye of the storm, and of course the storm came and destroyed the house, the neighborhood, everything green for miles around, robbed that community of everything that had held it together, all the functionality of it, and it took a long time to come back. Our family was directly affected, and I was just intellectually challenged and personally challenged to make sense of it, you know, to somehow figure out what was happening. And because I had an interest in gender before, and because my loving husband was in Kalgoorlie at the time, right, he's a geologist, so he was gone, and we were struggling through this event by ourselves with my 2 small children. With both of those kind of personal and intellectual reasons, I began to see these events through the eyes of women, through a gender lens, and recognizing, of course, that women are half of the world's population, so some of women's eyes and some of the issues that have come up. But it led me to a real concern about differences that emerge in before, during, and after these events we call disasters, and inequalities, and how it's just imperative now that we begin to address those in order to begin to think about a so-called resilient future. So I'm quite passionate about it. I think we're behind the 8 ball. We don't have much time to get it right, and I hope to contribute to getting it a little bit righter. So as I said, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a practitioner. I was a volunteer with the Red Cross after the event, of course, for some time, but I don't respond to disasters immediately. My role has been more doing research. I'm a field researcher, so study quite a bit of different kinds of disasters in the United States, in Canada, in Indonesia, and India, in Banda Aceh, in Sri Lanka. And I'm more of a trainer and policymaker as I get older, because I'm quite concerned that we're not using the information that we already have. So that's just a bit about me, so you know where I'm coming from. Let me just see if the system is going to work. I thought it might be easier if I just stood back here. Let's see. Yeah, so we don't have much time, and I warned Tricia I seem to be kind of programmed for the hour-long lecture, and I'm conscious of the time, and wanted to also thank you for taking time this morning to do that. So these are the kinds of things I'd like to cover this morning, beginning with some basic assumptions about disasters. You know, and you might understand these very well, but often I find that we don't. Disasters do not happen in the same way to anybody, right? So we have to look at disasters through the gender lens, even to understand what a disaster is. They are intrinsically gendered events because they unfold in our everyday worlds, which are, as you know, profoundly shaped by sex and by gender and by sexualities. We also know that women are often at increased risk, but that women, like men, have gender-based vulnerabilities and gender-based strengths that we bring to these things we call disasters. And the last point I think is quite important too, because gender is not something that happens out there all the time, but it happens wherever we are. It happens inside organizations. It happens in all workplaces. Happens is the wrong verb there, but it informs our relationships with one another. So in emergency management as well. So just briefly, I think that these will not be novel ideas to us, but sex as well as gender is very relevant in disasters. You have to look at sex-based disasters around reproductive health, around mental health issues which are different for women and for men, around lifespan, around some of the physical conditionings and the conditions of everyday life. If you're heavily pregnant, it's just a little bit harder to hold on to a tree in a raging flood, for example. And there are some patterns that are quite important to understand about men's and women's health conditions. Gender differences, the second kind of dimension here, are extremely relevant, both in terms of our everyday lives, the division of labor that puts us physically in different places. I used to tell my students, if you wanted to know something about your future, go to a school and look at 3 o'clock and see who is picking up children there at 3:15. I mean, there's a physicality to, maybe it's different in Australia, but there's a physicality to our daily routines that's based around gender, and that puts us in harm's way relative to different kinds of hazards. So our daily relationships change, our physical location has changed. Obviously the job-based or occupation-based skills, the knowledge, the traditions, the history, the social relationships, everything you build at work, that also brings women and men into these crisis moments with a different kind of worldview, different skills, and how we think about ourselves as manly or unmanly in disasters, or feminine or strong or resilient or weak or dependent. All these heavily gender-laden words are come into play as well. But my brief basically is that more than sex, more than sexuality, which I haven't touched on yet, and more than gender difference is gender inequality. Really, because disasters are fundamentally unequal events. They don't hit us all the same. So gender is one of the ways that helps us understand why they are so differently. The level of development in a country, level of development of poverty, for example, in a particular neighborhood would be other things. But gender as well really comes into play. So just briefly, you would have to look at these kinds of economic differences and inequalities really between women and men, which would vary depending on what group of women you're looking at, what time you're looking at, what the cultural context is you're looking at. You'd have to look at exposure to violence and living with HIV/AIDS, for example, looking at disabilities as they are differentially distributed between women and men and mean something different. You'd have to look at factors related to the family and to the household structure. Who makes most of these decisions? What kinds of social protections are in place for women who do not live with men in a male-dominated society? What happens with households that may be lesbian households or complex households or transnational households, that transnational being households back in another country that are supported by households here, right? It's a very complex question, families. Looking at transportation patterns that vary in terms of difference between women and men. Who owns that car? Who has the keys to the car? Who can actually get out? And of course, housing. Women and men live in different kinds of housing situations, with women typically having less secure housing conditions. Your marriage ends, you might be out of that house, even though it might have been your family home for many, many years. So those are some of the kind of general patterns that we would look at analytically in any country, but I don't want to dwell on those. I'd like to take us a little bit to a different direction and talk a little bit about this gender lens, beginning with the fact that we don't want to recreate another set of gender myths, right? So this is not about demeaning men or elevating women unnecessarily. It's just about understanding these basic patterns of everyday life, right? So it's not anti-male, it's not a fad. It's also, importantly, not more work for the weary. I hear this sometimes when I meet with emergency managers, and I do a fair amount of teaching, I meant to say, of emergency management students, who just see it as like one more thing they have to take on board when they're right in the middle of dealing with a disaster, and now we want them to think about women, and we want to think about race, ethnicity, or age. We're like, please, give me a break. It's not that. It's a way of using our resources more effectively, using it in a way that's more just also, that leads us toward a more resilient society in the future. It's basically, as I said, good practice. It's a way of using our resources. It's a way of fully engaging our communities, and that's my kind of takeaway message. It's also, importantly, I think, a bridge to the future for the next generation of emergency managers, because the next generation will not look like this generation of emergency managers. We're all, in a way, in a community-based approach to disaster management. We are all, if you will, disaster managers. We have to obviously move beyond our gender stereotypes. We have these notions of how men and women act in crisis. And if we had a little bit more time, we could talk about how ideologies about women and men are expressed in popular culture of disaster. How many of you have seen a disaster movie? One of those flicks? Yeah, right. I was once going to try and write a paper about gender relations as they're depicted in there, but I only made it through one disaster film because they're just so awful. I can't deal with it. But it was Volcano, right? And you can imagine. But it's a good exercise to think about how women's and men's relationships are depicted in cartoons, in music, in video, because that's the knowledge that we bring with us to a crisis. We don't differentiate that. So having said just those few basic points, I'd like to present very briefly, really, we don't have much time to talk in depth about any of these, but after 20-some years now of doing disaster and gender research internationally in developed and developed countries, we have learned a lot, really. So just briefly, to run through these essential 10 points. We've learned, as I said, that sex and gender matter for all the reasons that I had on the board before, but also for the control over those key survival resources. When we do our mapping, we look at the resources that people bring to hazards, like do they have cars, do they have savings accounts, do they have physical health, do they have time, do they have the capacity to move themselves, they have autonomy, all these kinds of resources. And sex and gender distribute that kind of self-control. What kind of degree of capacity do people have to take care of themselves? That again is shaped by gender. So we've learned the obvious, most essential message is that it matters. And it matters everywhere, that structural inequalities are not an aberration, they're actually deeply embedded in pretty much every culture. So again, it's incumbent upon us to take this on board. But women and men are differently at risk, obviously, through some of these kinds of examples. So health disparities, for example, women and men are differently exposed depending on the kind of formal employment that we have, the nature of the employment, the kinds of jobs we have, whether they're contingent labor, flexible labor, part-time labor, whether you're working with a big bureaucracy that can support you after a disaster or not. Definitely vary in terms of exposure to violence, interpersonal violence, which we'll be talking about this week. And importantly, we've also learned, but not enough, that sex and gender are as important in the lives of boys and men as they are in the lives of girls and women. It's a truism, really. And you would wonder, wouldn't you, why our field has not yet explored analytically through really good field research what it feels like, what it means to men to live through these things that we call disasters. Because we're all on this planet together, and we all, for the most part, live together. So it matters hugely that women and men understand each other, the differences and the similarities. So we've learned, obviously, that gender is an important part of men's lives, and that men also accrue gender power sometimes in a flood or in a fire that they might not have had before, or build on that to act in ways that women are not necessarily able to. That men interact in gendered ways. I was speaking this morning about a new piece of research coming from Canada that talks about men who bring different senses of themselves as manly, depending on whether they're bush firefighters or structural house firefighters, in a good case study from Canada. And there'll be a book coming out about that too, about different ways of being manly, which can be disruptive in terms of getting the job done, and that's why it's important. Differences and inequalities both matter. I don't think I'll stay long on this slide because I've made this point before, I think. But again, we need to understand that to point out to gender is not only to point to the differences in our everyday lives, but also to look at those power relationships between women and men and get at the tensions where those things come together. And we look at our specific communities, your specific groups of women, specific groups of men, and facing a specific hazard, you have to drill down here and get at these differences, and as well as the inequalities. Importantly, and this has been something that took us quite a while to get to, we're understanding that not only vulnerabilities arise from gender relationships, right, but capacities. And there's a lot of talk now, isn't there, about resilience, and sometimes we think about resilience as being on one end of a continuum and vulnerability being over here, and we just all happily walk from one end to the other. But it's not that way, is it? Because, you know, poor women, for example, might have economic vulnerabilities, but might at the same time have really important cultural knowledge about managing environmental resources in their community, or have social networks that are quite dense and can be life-saving. It can help people get out of the house and get on with it, and then get back and relocate and reestablish themselves again through those networks. So it's not one or the other. And our brief, I think, is to try and understand and tease out those differences between the vulnerabilities that people bring on the basis of gender and their capacities. So that was an important learning for us. We also have learned that sex and gender cross-cut every other power dynamic. So when you talk about the vulnerability, for example, of older people to extreme heat, right? It's important that we understand that that's a highly feminine, female-dominated population, and it matters, right? Because again, women's patterns of friendships, their economic status, their housing security, their sense of themselves as capable or not capable in a crisis, that comes into bear in an extreme heat emergency. So it's important that we understand that sex composition. And you can see there's the kind of statistical segregation or domination of a particular sex group in a group, but also that relative vulnerability varies by sex, just the same way our daily life varies by sex. So this cross-cutting, but also very direct effects as well. You need to understand, we need to understand as a community of practitioners, that violence, for example, is incapacitating. Fear is incapacitating. It's not resilience building. So if we don't take on board women's and men's and boys and girls' safety for any other reason, in disaster work we have to take it on board, because it undermines that ability of people to be safe, to make themselves safe, to find good space to take their family, to evacuate safely, and to reestablish themselves. So there are very direct effects. Women, for example, depend on your community, but would have, she's giving me a signal, but I'm not interpreting it, so.
Halfway through.
Thank you very much. We would also have different levels of mental illness, for example, that would come into play, that again relate directly to being female in a male-dominated world, and less control, less ability to be autonomous actors in a crisis. So one of the conclusions from this research is that in general, and this would not surprise any of you in this room, I don't think, after this time, that women are the most directly affected, most severely affected, and most affected over a broad kind of area of our lives. And nothing about what I've said says that men are not affected. It's not, again, I drive this point home, it's not a question of caring less or more about women or men or boys or girls. It's a question of trying to figure out how to build the strength and resilience that every family needs, that every neighborhood needs, every community needs. And we can't get there unless we take on board some of these differences. But these are the ways, when you read the literature and examine the case studies, that you see that women are affected. The household responsibilities just blossom at the very same time that your households are not functioning anymore, or maybe you're miles and miles of kilometers away from them. You haven't been home for quite some time. There are more psychosocial effects. That's one of the most widely documented differences in this body of literature, that women experience much more stress. Well, it raises lots of questions about that. We might want to talk a little bit more about that. But we certainly express and we share those feelings of distress around disasters. Do men have the same kind of support or social support for speaking about their feelings in that way, or for being heard when they do in a relief center? I don't think so. So that's one of the things that we would have to look at too. But on balance, and you may be aware of a major study that's a quantitative study of nations around the world that has established once and for all that women are more likely to die in disasters as well, in major disasters in developing countries. I think that's actually the wrong question for us to ask, but it often comes up. It's not the case that men always die more often in disasters, but in different contexts they do, women, I'm sorry, in different contexts that they do. If we're looking at heat, for example, in some countries you'll find that women are more likely to be struck by heat, and other countries like Chicago and my own country, men more likely to die. We can talk more about that. That's another story. So another lesson learned, if you will, is that women are beginning to mobilize. These are just an example of this Gender and Disaster Network. I don't know if you're familiar with it yet, but it's a really good resource. It's a global network of practitioners and researchers, policymakers, national figures. It's really grown remarkably in the last 10 years. This is the logo of Empower, a new organization for women in emergency management, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about whether there is such a group in Australia. There was a wonderful article in the book that we did called The Gender Train of Disaster that Dune Robertson wrote from the Red Cross. I don't know if that's a familiar name for you, but she was talking about a women in emergency management network in Australia. Perhaps it's come along. And the sampler is a sampling of resources in the field. So there's been a lot of organizing around it, and we have numerous resources, including this fabulous group Firefoxes, which from Australia, of course. Many resources available for women and men who are interested in doing something around gender. So stepping back from this field after 20 years, you can say that this is kind of a really rapid overview, the lay of the land. This is kind of what we've learned. But I guess I'm tired of doing one more field study, because really the findings are pretty much the same everywhere. I don't know your communities very well, but I think if we went and spoke right now to flood-affected women and men, we would hear a lot of these same issues. We really, I'd be quite surprised if we heard anything that's radically different there. So my sense of urgency now comes from using this knowledge that we have in some way. So I spent the last couple of years writing training manuals and guidelines and checklists and brochures and trying to get a new network going that's based just in the United States called the Gender and Disaster Resilience Network. And one of the pieces that brings me to is thinking about the organizational base of what we do. So I've put together a list of kind of questions, things that we need to ask ourselves. You see, I use the editorial "we" as if I were an emergency manager, which I am not, but to think about critically, to be some self-critical, I guess, thinkers about how our organizations take on board gender or do not. So here are some of the questions that I would hope that the Red Cross would take on board, that planning agencies, land use planning agencies, that social welfare agencies and health agencies, and of course disaster management agencies would ask themselves long before the next fire season and long before the next drought comes back. So for example, do you have risk assessments that are realistic, that really do get at, that drill down enough to understand what's the condition of single mothers or of widows or of indigenous women in your community? What's their health status? What's their transportation status? How many languages are spoken by women and by men in your community? If you don't have the sex disaggregated data, you will not be able to answer that And then afterwards, or in doing planning or in doing community outreach, you won't be able to reach your community because you won't know the dailiness of their everyday life. You would want to know for sure, or you would ask yourself, if your planning reflects the resources of the experts in your area, the subject experts, and I would put women's health networks right up there. There you wouldn't be the only group that disaster managers would want to turn to, but there are deeply embedded professional networks and personal networks in every community that are very knowledgeable about high-risk women, about senior women, about women living with HIV/AIDS, about single mothers, about single fathers. We need to bring them into the work that we do. We would ask ourselves, how are these networks or organizations actually participating? Are they consulted? That's one question. And of course, we have those wonderful checklists that talk about how many women were at that last meeting, right? But more importantly, what are the outcomes of consultation? Did we have a space that was accessible to women, that was safe, that was a good time? Did we listen to what women said? And then, did we act at all on that? What was the lesson taken out of that? What were the actual outcomes? And which services are included in our internal communication, in our networks, in our events, and which is not? This is a very important question. The work of disaster management is not as widespread or community-based as we would pretend it to be. I would put it to you that, and would like to be corrected if it's different here, but it's a very specialized kind of body of work that's over here. This is the emergency management community. These are the SES folks, and the rest of us are here, right? But in fact, the spirit of the time is to have community-based risk reduction. And again, we won't get there until all of our services, women's services in particular, are part of what we do, not an add-on, but part of what we do. So those are some of the questions. And they continue. How is your agency networked? How do you share information? When you do a training or a scenario-based training, are you involving women and men in ways that are relevant? There was one initiative in Manitoba where I was teaching a few years back. It was a training to see what would happen if there were a flood in that community that would close the school down, right? And everybody was at the table, all the big players, all the infrastructure managers, the political leaders were there, but there were no mothers there, there were no parents there. So what would happen actually if that school were shut down at 3 o'clock because of a major flood? Parents would come, would they not? So that no pre-thinking about how they would manage this massive influx of parents coming in their cars in a town like Manitoba. There wouldn't be any other way to do that. So it's one small example of how we have to get real about our communities. So you need to make sure that those trainings and community exercises are reflective of the diversity of the community, and also about how we could reach, how we ourselves, the disaster managers or the specialists in the area, could be reached by women who wanted to reach us about that. Homeless women, for example, right? Migrant women coming in and out, new immigrant women who don't understand yet the risks that they may be faced. Like I didn't understand the risk of a cyclone when I moved to Miami at all. How could they reach us? How would they even know about us? And would they be heard ever? So those are some questions. Two more sets of questions briefly around programming. And some of these ideas are quite similar. But do we take on board the training of staff around gender relations? Do we take it seriously? For the most part, I think we don't yet, right? But I urge every organization that's involved in this to be self-critical and ask how many people I could send to a refuge or send to a community meeting who would actually understand these gender-based dynamics. And if not, why not? If we expect them to be culturally sensitive, if we expect them to be sensitive to the issues that come up for older people, why are we not also integrating into the work that we do some sensitivity to how gender and sex and sexuality shape everybody's daily lives? But we would also ask, do the kinds of programs that we have target women as well as men who live at increased risk in particular hazard contexts? We never have enough resources to reach everybody. We're always making decisions about who's the priority group to get to, right? So if we're interested in meeting with the homeless, for example, would we go only to homeless shelters because men are more likely to be there? Or would we also want to ask, where are homeless women? Their patterns of homelessness are different. They're more couch surfers, right? So to target that community means knowing about some of those gender differences and going there, going where they are. We'd also want to ask how women and men are differently perhaps involved in preparedness and mitigation. You can read that. I don't think I'll spend much time on that. Is programming based on knowledge of social trends and patterns? This is a question about thinking about the future. Are we looking ahead? Do we understand what the lifespan might be? What are the health conditions that are changing? I mean, in my country, it's all about obesity now, but obesity has different health effects for women and for men and affects women and men differently, right? That's just one trend. Are households getting larger? Are they getting smaller? When with a more diverse community, are you having more people speaking fewer languages or vice versa? There's so many questions that come up. We need to always be forward thinking in disaster risk management and look at the questions from through a gender lens as well, because they won't be the same for women or for men. Need to make sure that these relief centers and evacuation sites are both culturally accessible, but also that they are safe space. So on Friday, I'm happy to say we'll be in Melbourne. We'll have a full day to discuss violence against women and gender-based violence more broadly as an issue in disaster. But it comes up a lot in the interviewing that I've done with women who live at risk of violence and with the advocates who want so much to be there to help them and can't for very many different reasons. But sometimes that safe space that we think about is not safe for all women. It may not be safe for small children. It may not be safe for men. We don't know enough. But we have to ask the question and make sure. And that means consulting again with the experts in your community who can tell us about what the transgendered kids on the street, for example, would feel like. Where will they go if there were a massive explosion or a huge wildfire again, or an extreme wind? How well do our programs accommodate women and men who have different kinds of disabilities, or senior fathers, or senior, again, those are questions about particular groups that are based by, or that are formed by gender, but also by race or class or by age or disability, right? And it's again a plea that in our programming, we target particular groups the same way that advertisers target us, right? You know, the whole notion of using social marketing techniques in disaster, I think, is well taken. Disaster managers can learn a lot from the advertisers who know who they are trying to reach. Google is a case in point. I'm sure you've been following that story this last week, right? And we have, targeted ads that are targeted just to us on the basis of their knowledge of us. And some of us may not like that. This is exactly what they're doing, though, is to try and frame that message. So this is a question of framing the message to reach the people who we most need to reach. And in our, the third point here, in our staff and workplace, some of the questions that we would want to ask, again, are opportunities both for women and for men, and in traditional roles and in non-traditional roles. So usually we focus on women moving up in an organization from staff positions to line positions, for example, or from being a dispatcher to being a firefighter, right? But we need also to look at men who might be interested in doing one-on-one psychosocial work with recoverers from a major disaster. Do they have the same kind of latitude coming in to work in that field if they want to? Perhaps more here than in the United States. Do we have staff and volunteers who actually speak the language, who have the same kind of ratio of sex as the community that we're representing, that bring those same kind of life skills and community knowledge with them? That's essential that we begin to do that. Again, I've mentioned the question about training. Do we have the expectation that when we go out to the community, we will of course send a woman and a man, because we need to communicate with and hear too and listen to both women and men. This, of course, is a point about the distribution of women in the decision-making hierarchy of an organization. And this is a point about the fact that both women and men have family responsibilities. Now, it was said for a long time that there was never a problem with disaster management, that men would always put work first. It's a hugely important question for researchers. When push comes to shove, will they be there, right? And the answer was always yes. Men would leave everything aside and come, but that was a different time. It was a different generation, right? A lot of men don't have that same kind of backup support system, the wives at home taking care of things while they go off for weeks at a time or in the middle of the night, right? And conversely, with more women in the field, you don't have necessarily that backup support system. So there is an intrinsic conflict between being responsible to the people you love and the people with whom you work, right? And it arises both for women and for men, and it's acute in the period of a crisis. So it behooves us to think about that in advance, what could be done. You can take a look at these ideas, but basically I think I've mentioned that last point. How salient is gender equality? I think this is an important self-assessment question for people doing work in the area. We are madly in love, I think, with the new social media of tweeting and Facebook. Most people actually are not going to go there, and they're not going to look at you in the moment of crisis, but they might in advance, right? If you're a school teacher or if you're a city manager, or you're running the power system, you might go to the website of the disaster management agency or the Red Cross or the SES or any of the organizations that are active in these things we call disasters, right? That public face, if you will, may be the first and only feel that they get for the work that you do. So I think, again, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the website itself, the language that's used, the pictures that are used, the text that's used, the text and the subtext, if you will, are opening and welcoming to gender and to gender analysis. That's part of what we do. It's an important piece of our work. So I'll just wrap up here, having tried to give you a very rapid-fire kind of introduction for some of the main findings from the field, and then some of the ways that I think we could make it practical. Again, making sure we have these risk assessments, the sex-specific data, that we have sustained and real and meaningful consultations with women's and men's groups, that we understand enough about our own community around gender so that we can do meaningful work and reach the people that we need to reach most. But I also think just in general, let's see if this is a two-pager, yeah. These are the kinds of things I think we have to do, obviously, to put the, build on our knowledge base, to make sure that those who are most at risk, who are likely to be women and girls, at the top of the list, to act on those practical issues that we learn from when you listen to survivors, to listen to men much more about how gender shapes their realities before, during, and after, to use a so-called window of opportunity. You hear about that a lot, making lemon out of lemonades, right? Trying to somehow build a back better, build a more resilient community. Again, we won't get there until we understand how inequality of any kind, and here we're talking about gender justice, undermines solidarity in the community, undermines solidarity in the neighborhood, certainly undermines it in the community at large. So to get there, I think there are just a few principles of engagement, and these won't surprise you now. I think they'll be familiar, but we have to listen to women. I can't emphasize this enough. And some of you may be thinking that's all I ever do is I talk with women all the time because they're so present in the recovery period, so much a part of the response period. But do we really listen? Do you have to ask? I know as a researcher, it's easy to think that you know what somebody knows. But you have to ask the right question in the right way. You have to be there, walk in their shoes, and make a place for them to really articulate. And when you disagree with their ideas, that's fine. That's what you're after. Nobody's going to agree about everything. You want to understand it from their points of view and understand the diversity of women. But you also need to help make sure that women are empowered, that they have that social space, that they know that you value what their answers are, right? To bring them into the center of what you're doing and have them ask and answer their own questions. At one level, that's a question about risk assessments, so involving women's groups and women's organizations in developing those risk assessments. It's also about just being sure when you go out and do public awareness work in the community that you're listening to women in an empowering way, not a protective, we'll take care of your dear, don't worry about a single thing, just make sure you've got 72 hours worth of water. No, but to really understand that they, women like men, have a stake in the resilience and the safety of their community and will act to protect it. To develop and strengthen capacities, I think I've just spoken to that. To plan for accessibility and participation, it sounds like a small point, but really, if you have all of your public meetings when the kids are at home and waiting for dinner, you will not have very many women. You won't have a lot of single fathers either, right? If you have them all at night in a place that's a little dicey, that may not be on a public transportation line, you won't have a lot of women either. In your community, I think the issues wouldn't come up particularly here, but it's important that we have meaningful consultation. We also need to have some formalized leadership roles in that recovery process for the advocates who bring with them a sense of some of the inequalities, the daily challenges that women face. Here I think it's quite important. I'm thinking of anti-violence, women's rights activists, women's health activists, women who work with indigenous women and new immigrant women, women who work with women with disabilities. These are very valuable partners. And they need to have formalized kind of leadership roles in that recovery process to recognize and build on their expertise. To institutionalize, and that's kind of follows from that. We need to reach marginalized women through their own networks. That again is a question of information and knowledge sharing. Make sure that we're all on the same page, sharing through internet, sharing through community events, sharing through resources like the report and the research report that we'll be hearing about soon. And to support this is last, I think this is my last point, let's just see. No, okay, I'm just going to speed up here. To support, make sure that those women's agencies and the direct service agencies to women will not flood out, will not fall down or be burned up, that they are resistant to hazards. That's a very important piece of resilience. Need to make sure that gender responsiveness is part of personnel review, to have some sense that there will be costs associated to reaching everybody in our community, and that's good, that's the way it needs to be. Think ahead about those, have those funding streams in line. Plan, of course, for long-term recovery. I mentioned to these. And to begin to do all of this work with a sensitivity to men's as well as women's stake in a more just and more resilient and safer society for everybody. We won't get there if we have activities we call gender mainstreaming over there that men are never involved in. I think we've learned that lesson quite well, but perhaps not yet in emergency management. So with that, I really do thank you for sitting here it's such a nice group with such nice expressions on your faces, nice smiles, to listen to this very rapid-fire presentation. And I do look forward to our conversation because it gets intriguing the more you drill down a little bit.